If you're enjoying the Witness Files on Haunted UK podcast, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or Ko-fi. Simply search for Haunted UK podcast to find us. And if you have a witness file of your own, we'd love to hear from you. Send your story to contact us at hauntedukpodcast.com. Hidden deep within the archives of the Haunted UK podcast sits a filing cabinet, filled with first-hand accounts of paranormal and unexplained encounters sent in by ordinary people who experienced something extraordinary. These are not urban legends. They're not campfire stories. They are witness statements. Each file is a real submission, shared by someone who saw, heard, or encountered something they still can't explain. For years, these accounts have remained sealed, locked away, and catalogued. Until now. In this series, we open the files, we unlock the archive, and we let the witnesses speak for themselves. What follows may challenge what you believe about the world around you, and what might exist just beyond it. So let's open the filing cabinet and select a case file. Some stories aren't about fear. They're about presence, about connection, and about the idea that love doesn't necessarily end when life does. The following case was sent in by Jenny. It spans generations, wartime London, a haunted fire station, and a promise made between two people. A promise that may never have been broken. This is the Witness Files Case 1. Waiting on the Other Side. Firstly, I must, for the sake of honest disclosure, tell you that I grew up with a mum who not only believed in the paranormal, but had herself experienced many occurrences. I'm therefore, and most definitely, as Danny Robbins would say, team believer. Within our family circle, my mum's mother was affectionately known as the Welsh Witch, and she had the uncanny knack of predicting events both good and bad, some just family happenings, but sometimes those on the wider world stage. So perhaps she passed this down to her descendants. I remember vaguely the hushed discussions on events when they happened, but as a small child, I was never given specifics, so I'm unable to provide you with any detail to corroborate my claim. My mum was born in 1929, and during the Second World War was a young girl bombed out of her home several times. She and her baby brother were also evacuated 3 times when things became too rough in London. She grew up in the Peckham area, and her last home, where she stayed after the war and until she married, was a 3-storey terraced house in Elmington Road, SE5. She had her own bedroom and recounts on many occasions being woken by 2 women chatting in her room at night. She could hear them clearly, but could never understand what they were saying, as they were speaking in a language unknown to her. The chatting would go on for hours, and she became very used to hearing them. She believed the language to be Italian, but was never able to verify it. In those days, there was not the multiculturalism there is today, and she never went abroad, so deciphering an unknown language would have not been easy. She would wake, hear them, and in the early times get out of bed, still listening to them speaking, and would sit in front of her mirror brushing her hair or talking to herself, just to be sure she was awake. She would even pinch herself on occasion, but the voices would keep chatting on around her. She told me that they did stop visiting her eventually, but only after my grandmother gave birth to a new baby girl when my mother was 18. When the baby was 6 weeks old, she came to sleep with my mum every night, and Mum would care for her until the early morning. After that, the women never visited my mum ever again. After her marriage in the early 1950s, she, my dad, and my baby brother Stephen moved into a new home. In those days, fire stations were also homes, and my dad, being a newbie fireman with a young family, was given a 2-bedroom home at Flat 5, the fire station, Bethnal Green, London, built in 1871, and now the London Buddhist Centre. From the moment they moved in, my mum had uncanny experiences, but took them in her stride, being something she had lived with previously. My dad, born of religious parents, had been taught to dismiss talk of ghosts and the paranormal, and when my mum used to try to engage with him on the subject, was gentle, as he always was, but dismissive. The flat was on the top floor of the fire station, and living there was an enclosed community of sorts. They made friends with other firefighters and families, and, being the mid-1950s, my mum stayed home and looked after my brother. Often things would go missing. Small baby items, like socks or bibs, which she always used to roll up into balls. When they would appear again days later in the most unlikely places, often the socks would appear in a ring in the middle of her bed. Stephen wasn't even 6 months old when this began, so I think we can rule out the interference of there being any little mischiefs involved in this particular manifestation. In the 1950s, there was also a program on the radio called Two-Way Family Favorites, which millions of people listened to, where today daytime television would be the norm. This show would play all the pre-war and war tunes, as well as the more modern music, and my mum would have it on while she was doing her housework and looking after Steve. She told me she always knew someone else was in that flat with her, and on many occasions she would hear a man whistling to the old music and moving around the flat with her. While most of the time she was unfazed by his joining in, sometimes she used to ask him to give it a rest, and he would obligingly stop for a while, but eventually he would rejoin her in her daily routine and his enjoyment of the radio. As my brother grew up, he would become incredibly distressed if the weather was bad, particularly thunder and lightning. He would become completely hysterical, and my parents would have to stay with him in order to calm his fears. Some years later, when we'd moved to Aylesbury and were living in our new home, my mum recalled these events and mentioned it to Steve, saying that even though we were now far out into the country, he seemed to have grown out of this terror of bad weather. In his innocence, Steve turned to my mum and said, "Well, yes, the man doesn't come to stand at the end of my bed anymore when it's raining." Even recently, when we briefly discussed it, he remembered the man in Flat 5. There's nothing in the records that states the fire station took a direct hit during the war, but we do know that several firemen who were stationed there lost their lives. There's even a story that at least one lost his life while trying to help those involved in the Bethnal Green tube disaster, but I've not been able to find specific documentation of that being the case. We used to speculate that perhaps it was a lost fireman from the Blitz who remained to help others and tried to comfort Steve, not understanding that it made him freak out. My mum thought that was likely to be the case because he would only join in with the songs that were well known before and during the war. When my brother was 3 years old, I was born, and we remained in the flat until I was nearly 4. My dad had continued to downplay my mum's belief in her visitor, but many years later, at a get-together with old friends who lived in the flat below ours, my dad told a very enlightening story. When I was about 9 months old, my mum had to go back into hospital for surgery. She was away for several nights, the old-fashioned NHS, and my dad was left in charge of us. We slept in the second bedroom by then, but my dad sheepishly confessed to the gathering that during the nights she was away, he'd taken us both into his bed with him, because he was terrified of the sounds he heard and the overwhelming feeling that there was someone else in the flat with us. Poor Dad. He was so embarrassed, especially having dismissed my mum's beliefs for years, that he just couldn't tell her at the time, and it only came out years later. We remained friends with the people from the flat below until I was well into my 20s, and we used to meet up regularly. On one occasion, I remember them all talking about the old fire station. It may have been on the occasion of my dad's confession. They admitted that one room at the end of their passageway, which was directly under our flat, was never used. They tried to use it as a bedroom, but their daughters had hated it and wouldn't sleep there, saying there was something wrong in the room. So a very valuable space, when the flats were not that big at all, had been relegated to a junk room. I've often wondered whether the folks at the London Buddhist Centre have met our errant fireman, and being such spiritual beings, have embraced and welcomed him in the way that my mother did. I've always been fascinated with the afterlife, but have never sought out or wished for anything to happen to me. My mum used to tell me that ghosts were friendly and would not deliberately hurt me. I think she was being kind. And if I didn't want to see anything, then I just had to say, "Please don't come," and all would be well. My brother, on the other hand, has had many experiences, and having recently moved to a new home, is sure the old lady who lived in the house with her husband and family from the time it was built is there with them. She's begun to play pranks, moving and hiding items which they find in the strangest of places, when they do come back. He believes she will settle down once all the redecoration has been done. She's just a bit unsettled by new owners making so many changes to her home. My only personal experience is really through my son and after my dad's passing in 2006. My son was not quite 10 when he lost his granddad, and they were very close, as is often the case. I had him late, so he was a double miracle for my parents. My son used to go to cathedral every Tuesday at school and would either be in the choir at the front of the church or in the congregation, depending upon the occasion. About 6 months after my dad passed away, he came home and told me that he'd seen Grandad at cathedral that day. Being a believer, I had little doubt he could have seen him and asked for details. My son had been in the choir that day and had seen my dad sitting between two of his classmates in the pews at the front of the church. He'd smiled and nodded at my son, and he smiled back. He didn't stay long, he said. He just faded away. The second time was around 3 months later, and again he was in cathedral. This time he was sitting in the pews with his friends. He leaned forward to speak to one, and he said that Grandad had leaned forward in front of his friend and smiled at him. He said he could see his friend through my dad this time, when the time before he'd been very solid, but it was definitely him. He'd smiled back and had turned to tell his friend on the other side that his Grandad was there, but when he'd turned back, he'd gone. He also said that when he saw him, both times his Grandad looked like himself, but different. My father had suffered a great deal with emphysema, very much a 1950s fireman's illness, prior to his death at the age of 74, and looked a lot older than his years. Some months later, my mum, who was not one to have family photos everywhere in the house, asked me to obtain a frame for a photo she'd found of my dad that she wanted to put up. I did, and we placed it by the television so she could see him. It's a wonderful photo of my dad from when he was in his 40s, taken with his pipe and sitting on the deck of the fire brigade fireboat, Firebrace, based at Lambeth in the 1960s. He was then its coxswain, having transferred to the riverboat some years before. In the photo, he looks healthy and handsome and well. When my son saw it, he stopped suddenly and said, "That's it, Mum. I told you Grandad looked like himself, but different." He'd never seen the photo before, as my mum kept our family photos, as did most people, in an old suitcase in the attic, and it had only recently been rediscovered. I wonder if it's true, therefore, that once we pass over, we can choose to exist in the time we were most happy. My dad certainly was happy then, and it would make so much sense for him to choose that time, rather than later during his decline into ill health and infirmity. When I was in my 20s, I was given one of the first Casio electronic games. It came from Japan, and as a keen clay pigeon shooter, it simulated trap shooting. I gave it to my dad, also a keen shooter in his time, and he kept it in a drawer by his chair. He used to play the game when the mood took him, and it remained in his possession until he died. My mum then passed it back to me, although reluctant to take it. I knew she had no use for it. One afternoon, not long after he passed, I was at home sorting through some of his things, as one needs to do sadly, and with me was the Casio game. I'd laid everything on the bed in my spare room in order to sort and determine what to do with it. As I was packing things up, I suddenly heard the sound of the game, which is loud and distinctive. In order to play the game, it has to have batteries inserted, the lid has to be raised, and the game switched on from the start button. You use the right-hand knob to aim and the left-hand button to shoot. You need two hands, therefore, to play. The game then goes through several levels. The noises change with each level, and every time you push the shoot button, you can hear the distinctive sound of the game firing. As I said, the lid has to be lifted for the game to play. With the lid down, all you hear is the introduction noise, but again you have to lift the lid to manually switch it on. Not only was the lid down, but it had no batteries inside. And I could absolutely hear it ramping up and going through the levels as though it was being played. I've sent you an image and a recording of the game. Yes, it still works almost 40 years later. I was halfway down the corridor when it started, and I had clothing in my arms. I stopped in my tracks and then slowly walked backwards to the bedroom and stood in the doorway listening to the game being played and watching it laying on the bed in front of my eyes. It seemed like forever, but it was probably only a minute or so. Aim, fire, music. Aim, fire, music. On and on. Tears were streaming down my face, but eventually, as terrified as I was, I found my courage, walked into the bedroom, reached out my hand, and placed it over the closed game. "Hello, my darling," I said, and the game stopped playing. I'm sure Kieran O'Keefe would ask me to consider a multitude of electronic failure possibilities, but I am just as sure that Evelyn Hollow would be kinder and understand my deep-seated belief that my dad was with me on that day and had reached out in a way that ensured I would recognize him through something we had both shared. I hope it was him. I have one final tale to tell. About 9 months after my dad's passing, I went to see a medium. I'd not met this lady before, but had been given her name by a colleague. When I phoned, her husband took my booking and asked me for my first name and nothing else. I arrived and was taken in to see the lady, who was then in her 60s, I would judge. She said hello and asked me to hold her hand across the table. She asked me no questions, but immediately said I had a queue of spirits wanting to speak to me. She said, though, that the most important was my dad, James, called Jim. And yes, she said his name without prompting or fishing, who had recently passed, and he was with another man, a name I didn't know. She told me many things about my dad's passing, lost siblings, and family that she could not have known. She oversaw my mum, knew about her serious health conditions, and so many other things that without some insider knowledge, or me telling her loads of detail, I'm unsure she could have known. Could I have influenced her because I'm a believer? Perhaps. And I am honest enough to admit that is a possibility. Although, as I said, how could she have been as specific and as detailed as she was? I have no idea. The crux of this story, though, is this. When she'd almost finished, she said my dad had a message for my mum and asked me to pass it along. She said very specifically that I was to tell my mum that, quote, he would keep his promise to her, end quote. I asked for clarification, but she said that was all my dad had told her, and I was to tell my mum what he'd said. When I next saw Mum, I told her of my meeting, and she sat very quietly. I told her of the man who was with Dad that I didn't know, and she laughed. She told me she knew exactly who he was. His wife and my mum had their dialysis on the same days, and he'd passed away 2 days before my dad. Both men had been on the same ward together during the last days and had got to know one another through their visiting wives. Why he was with my dad, though, is still a mystery. Finally, though, I told her of my dad's message. When I'd finished, she began to weep, and if you'd known my mum, you would know that this was not a usual occurrence, no matter what the circumstances. I was mortified and apologized for upsetting her, but she waved me away and told me they were tears of joy. Then she explained her story to me. When they were young newlyweds, and even though my dad had declared, as mentioned earlier, his dismissal of the paranormal, she'd asked him for one boon, to which he agreed. The boon was that whichever one of them was to die first, they would promise to wait for the other until their time came. When it did, the one who'd gone over was to come back and take the others safely through to the other side. Through me, my dad had told my mum that he would keep his promise, made over 50 years before, that he would be waiting for her when her time came. Ultimately, he had 20 months without her and probably used that time to smoke his beloved pipe once more, sail around the world. His absolute love was the sea. Take the long succession of dogs he'd loved for eternal walks, and await the girl with whom he had chosen to spend eternity. I never felt the need to go back to the medium to contact my mum. I knew she was happy and safely with my dad. If I have someone waiting for me the way my dad waited for my mum, I will be a very happy woman when my time too comes around. Witness account provided by Jenny. And that brings us to the end of this case. The file is closed, the testimony logged, and for now, the archive falls quiet. But these stories don't disappear. They wait. And if you have a story to tell, an experience you still can't explain, why not send it into the show? Email us at contactus@hauntedukpodcast.com with the subject line, The Witness Files, and your account may become part of the archive. So be sure to join me here next time, deep within the archives, where we'll unlock another case, hear from another witness, and once again open the Witness Files. Until next time, stay safe and take care.